Part 1, The Man in the Mud, on the 30th of September, 1942, a B-17 broke through the cloud cover over a small island in the Solomon Islands chain and lined up on a strip of dirt called Henderson Field. The runway below was pocked with craters. The night before, Japanese warships had stood off the coast and shelled it in the dark. The night after, they would come back and do it again. No one on that island could tell you how much longer they would hold it. When the bomber rolled to a stop and the hatch swung open and a man in a rumpled khaki uniform climbed down into the mud, the Marines who saw him did not quite believe what they were seeing. Because the man's standing in the dirt, in the smell of burned aviation fuel and cordite, was Chester Nimitz, the commander of the entire United States Pacific Fleet. Every carrier, every battleship, every submarine, every man in uniform across the widest ocean on Earth answered in the end to him. He was the single most consequential American in the entire Pacific theater of the war, and there was a reason, men, that important did not go to places like this. If he fell here, one bomb in the night, one shell off a passing warship, one Japanese pilot who got lucky, the United States would lose the mind running the whole Pacific War at the exact moment that war was closest to being lost. Every rule of command said he should be somewhere safe, far to the rear. Moving fleets around a chart 1,000 miles to the south, on a ship anchored in a quiet harbor at Noumea, New Caledonia, was the officer who actually commanded this operation. That man worked for Nimitz. And in nearly 2 months of fighting, that man had never once set foot on this island. His own orders were deciding who lived and who died out here. He was reading the war from a desk on a ship that never moved. The one who was safe stayed away. The one with everything to lose flew in and put his boots in the mud. Why? The answer is not the one you would expect. He did not come for the danger. He did not come to prove anything. He came for one thing he needed so badly. He was willing to bet his own life to get it. One thing no report, no dispatch, no message sent back to Noumea or to Pearl Harbor could ever give him. He came for the truth, and to understand what he found there and why it mattered, you have to go back to the beginning of this story. To the morning of August 7th, 1942, to the first ground offensive the United States had attempted anywhere in the Pacific since the war began. The Marines came ashore on Guadalcanal at dawn, roughly 11,000 men hitting the beach in the first major American land attack of the entire Pacific campaign. Their objective was straightforward: get to the airfield the Japanese were building in the jungle, take it, and hold it. The airfield, once finished, would put Japanese aircraft over the Allied supply routes to Australia. That could not be allowed to happen. They came ashore, they pushed into the jungle, and they took the airfield within 2 days. It was half-built, rough, carved out of grass and coral. The Marines named it Henderson Field, after an aviator who had been killed at Midway. They brought in their own construction equipment and got to work. The objective was accomplished. The airfield was theirs. And then 48 hours after the landing, the Navy left them. It was not planned that way. The aircraft carriers covering the landing pulled back early. Their commander had watched what Japanese air power had already done in this war, and he was not willing to risk losing his carriers to it. Without carriers overhead, the transport ships unloading on the beach had no protection. Their commander made the only call he felt he could make. He pulled them out too. They left with their holds still full, food, ammunition, barbed wire, heavy construction equipment. More than half of what the Marines were supposed to have was still sitting in the bellies of those ships when the ships sailed over the horizon. 11,000 men on a jungle island, half their supplies gone, no naval protection overhead, no way off the island if things went wrong. And things went wrong that same night. In the Blackwater, just offshore, the Navy fought a battle it would spend years trying to forget. 4 Allied cruisers went to the bottom in a fight that lasted barely half an hour. Japanese naval forces operating in the dark had executed a perfect ambush. The stretch of ocean around the island where those ships went down would earn a name in the months to come. The men who fought over it would call it Iron Bottom Sound, for what they knew was resting on the floor of it. So the Marines were alone, cut off from the sea on reduced rations, counting their bullets, digging in around a half-finished airfield with whatever they had managed to carry ashore before the ships left. They were the first American ground troops to go on the offensive in the entire Pacific. And in the second week of that offensive, they were for all practical purposes on their own. For 6 weeks after that, they held through the shelling. Almost every night, Japanese warships slipped down the channel between the islands and stood off the coast and fired their naval guns into the airfield, and the men dug in around it. Big guns throwing shells the size of a man into the dark at troops who could do nothing but press themselves into the earth and wait. The Marines gave these nightly visitors a name. They called them the Tokyo Express, and they came and came and came, They held through the sickness. Malaria moved through the ranks like a second enemy, quieter than the first, and in some ways more efficient. It pushed men's temperatures past 104 degrees. It put more Marines on their backs than Japanese bullets did. A man could be shivering with fever at dawn and still be expected to hold his section of the line that night. There was no one to replace him. They held on food they took from the enemy. When their own rations ran short, they ate captured Japanese rice out of captured Japanese stores and were glad to have it. They held because a Marine general named Alexander Vandegrift had decided quietly and without theatre that they would. And because the men in the foxholes had made the same decision, one foxhole at a time. But holding is not the same as winning. Every night the express came back was another night the men had simply not lost yet, and from the outside, from the message traffic moving back and forth between the island and the command ships far to the south, it did not look like holding at all. It looked like a slow bleed on an island that most people back home could not have found on a map. In a campaign the country was not sure was worth the cost, because the officer running the operation had never seen it. Vice Admiral Robert Ghormley was 60 years old. He had spent his career in the Navy. He was not a coward, and he was not incompetent. He was an experienced officer doing the job the way 30 years of professional training had taught him to do it. From the chart, from the message traffic, from the reports stacked on his desk aboard his command ship in the harbor at Noumea. In almost 2 months of fighting on Guadalcanal, Ghormley had never once been to the island. He had never walked the ground his orders were shaping. He had never sat across from Vandegrift and looked the man in the face. He had never seen the airfield, the ridge lines, the exhausted men holding the perimeter. He knew the battle the way a man knows a place from reading about it. And the words were not telling the truth, not because anyone was lying, but because a report cannot carry what a place feels like when you are standing in it. It cannot carry the particular weight in a tired man's voice. It cannot carry the look on the face of a general who has not slept in a week. It flattens everything down to lines on a page. And the lines were not enough. Nimitz read every one of those dispatches from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles from the fighting, and he could not get the truth out of them either. They contradicted each other. One message said the situation was desperate. The next said the airfield was holdings. They asked for reinforcements, and then asked again, and the asking had a tone to it that a careful reader could not miss. A tone of a man running out of confidence faster than he was running out of men. Nimitz needed to know one thing. The single most important question in the entire Pacific in the autumn of 1942, could Guadalcanal actually be held? Or was it time to pull the Marines off that island while there was still a way to pull them off and put American strength, put Americans somewhere? Thousands of lives hung on the answer, so did the shape of the whole Pacific War. Washington was already arguing about it. The Secretary of the Navy told a reporter he wasn't sure the island could be saved. Officers on MacArthur's staff were saying quietly that pulling out of Guadalcanal might be the smarter call. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had read the same paper. Nimitz could not get the answer from paper he had tried. The paper wasn't working, so he decided to go and see it himself. Pipette 2, what the reports could not carry. 2 weeks before Nimitz's B-17 touched down on Henderson Field, the Marines had fought a battle on a piece of ground that would tell him more in an afternoon than 6 weeks of dispatches ever had. South of the airfield, there was a low, bare ridge, not impressive to look at, a scrub-covered rise above the jungle floor, unremarkable except for where it sat. It controlled the approaches to Henderson Field from the south. If that ridge fell, the airfield fell. If the airfield fell, the whole reason the Marines were on the island was gone. The battle for that ridge began on the night of September 12th, 1942. The Japanese came in waves in the dark through 2 nights of fighting, and at the worst of it, the tide had rolled back so far that the fighting reached almost to the edge of Vandegrift's own command post. A few hundred Marines stood on that rise against thousands of Japanese troops pressing up out of the jungle below. When it was over, the ground in front of the Marine positions told you everything about how close it had come. They called it Edson's Ridge, after the colonel who had commanded the men holding it. The men who had held it were still there when Nimitz arrived. He could have stayed near the runway. He could have taken the formal briefing, shaken some hands, and turned around. Everything about how senior commanders operated in 1942 would have supported that choice. You do not take the commanding admiral of the Pacific Fleet to the most dangerous ground on the island. Instead, Nimitz went to the ridge. He walked the ground where the line had almost broken. He moved slowly over the earth, where a few hundred men had stopped some things that should not have been stoppable. He saw the field in front of the defensive positions. He saw what it meant, in physical terms, in the actual weight of the terrain, that those men had held that ground and not given it back. And he saw the Marines still holding it gaunt from short rations, yellow-skinned from malaria, running on nothing but the flat and absolute refusal to let the ground go. No dispatch had ever made him feel the thinness of that line. Now he had walked it. Here is what reports do. They take a complex living thing and they compress it into language, and language, even the best language, leaves things out. It leaves out the way exhausted men hold their bodies differently from men who have simply had a hard day. It leaves out the look in a man's eyes when he has decided something all the way down to the marrow. It leaves out the specific quality of silence that falls over a position where men have just survived something they were not supposed to survive. Reports leave all of that out. And in the autumn of 1942, the reports coming out of Guadalcanal were full of the thing that worried Nimitz most: fear. Not the fear of the Marines on the line. Their fear was appropriate and they were managing it. The fear in the dispatches was coming from further up the chain, from the command layer between the island and Pearl Harbor. And fear is not information. You cannot plan against fear. You cannot move ships and aircraft in response to fear. You need facts, and the fear in the message traffic was drowning the facts. Ghormley, reading the same situation through his messages in Noumea, had grown increasingly pessimistic. His dispatches to Pearl Harbor carried the sound of a man who was no longer certain this could be done. He asked for more and more and more. He described the situation in terms that suggested he was watching a position collapse rather than hold. He was reading a battle through words, and words filtered through multiple layers of staff officers and communications procedures, and the natural human tendency to soften bad news before passing it upward had given him a picture that was blurred in exactly the wrong places. The officers who needed most to understand what was happening had the least direct access to what was actually happening. Meanwhile, in Washington and in MacArthur's headquarters, the debate over Guadalcanal was growing louder. The island was costing more than anyone had expected. The Japanese were pushing harder than the pre-invasion estimates had suggested. And the men arguing for withdrawal had, in their own way, the same problem Ghormley had. They were reading paper. They were arguing about a place none of them had been. Nimitz had read the same paper. He had reached the conclusion that the paper was not sufficient. There was only one thing left to do. He got on the plane. When the B-17 landed on Henderson Field and Nimitz stepped into the mud, there were people around him who understood exactly what kind of risk they were looking at. Nimitz was not a young officer. He was 57 years old, the commander of everything that floated under an American flag across the Pacific Ocean. Losing him to a Japanese shell or a strafing run would be a blow that no enemy victory on the water could have matched. He knew this. The men with him knew it, and he went anyway, because he had calculated that the risk of not knowing was greater than the risk of being there. He went to the ridge first. He spent time on that ground in a way that cannot be replicated by a photograph or a written account. He stood where the line had nearly broken and looked out at the approaches. The Japanese had come up, and he understood, stopped, in the way that only physical presence creates, understanding how thin the margin had been and what it had taken to hold. Then he found Vandegrift. The two men sat down together, not a formal briefing, not a prepared presentation. Vandegrift had not sent it a message this time. He sat across from him and said, in his own steady voice, what the dispatches had been trying and failing to convey for 6 weeks. He could hold the island. He believed it. Not as hope, not as optimism, but as operational assessment. He had looked at his lines, his men, his supplies, and the enemy's capacity, and he had reached a conclusion. But he could only hold it if the support that had been promised actually arrived, and arrived soon. More aircraft before the Japanese assembled enough air strength to shut Henderson Field down. More men before the next major ground attack. More of everything before the window closed. Nimitz heard that from the man's own mouth. He watched his face while he said it, and he measured the difference between a general who had been beaten and a general who was simply tired and still certain. It is a real difference. It shows in the jaw and in the eyes and in the particular quality of steadiness that comes from a man who has made his decision and is not looking to be talked out of it. That difference could not be transmitted by telegraph. You could not encode it. You could put it in a dispatch and send it to Pearl Harbor. But Nimitz could see it because he was there. He did not stop with the general. He went to the pilots who were flying off that cratered strip in worn-out aircraft, taking off between bomb craters to meet Japanese. The famines came nearly every day. He talked to the men holding the perimeter. He asked questions, and then he did the harder thing. He listened to the answers without interrupting, without filtering, without allowing his own prior assumptions to organize what he was hearing before he had heard it. He built his picture of the island from the ground up, from the people who were living on it, not from the message traffic coming down from above. And before he left, he stood in front of Marines who had held a line. The country back home was beginning to discuss abandoning, and he pinned Navy crosses on men who had earned them. Among them was Evans Carlson, whose raiders had carried the fight into the jungle in ways that were already becoming legend. Nimitz stood in front of those men. He was the highest-ranking American in the entire Pacific Ocean. He had come through contested airspace to stand on their island, to walk their ground, to eat their dust, to stand within range of the same guns that came for them every night. For 6 weeks, the Marines on Guadalcanal had felt like the war had moved on without them. They were holding an island that the people making decisions back home were starting to treat as a mistake, a commitment that had gone wrong, a problem to be managed rather than a battle to be won. And now the commanding admiral of the Pacific Fleet was standing in front of them, in person, on their island, in their mud. Word moved through the ranks the way word always moves through men who have been told for too long that no one is paying attention. Something shifted in those hours that no order could have produced and no dispatch could have transmitted. He had come. That was the thing. Against every calculation that said he shouldn't, he had come. Pepti 3, the change at the top. Nimitz flew back the way he came, and he carried something no paper could have given him. He now knew the island could be held. He had not read it. He had not been briefed on it. He had walked the ground where the line had nearly broken, and he had sat across from the man holding that line, and he had watched that man's face while he said plainly and without performance that he could do this if someone would give him what he needed. The question that had hung over the entire Pacific in the autumn of 1942, the biggest question in the theater, he had finally answered. And he had answered it with his own 2 eyes. But he had learned something else on that island, something harder to carry home. The Marines on Guadalcanal were doing everything that could be asked of human beings. The general leading them knew exactly what the situation required and had said so clearly and repeatedly for 6 weeks. The failure was not on the island at all. The failure was 1,000 miles to the south on a ship in a quiet harbor in a headquarters that had never come to see the battle it was directing. Ghormley was a decent officer. He was not a coward. He had spent 30 years in the Navy, earning the right to wear the stars he wore. But he had never been to Guadalcanal. He had never walked the ridge where the line had almost broken. He had never sat across from Vandegrift and read the certainty in the man's face. He had read a battle through words for 2 months, and the words had not been enough. A man who has not stood on a piece of ground cannot tell the difference between the fear that lives in the ground and the fear that lives in the man reporting about it. Ghormley had no way to know which kind of fear his dispatches were carrying, and so he had passed it upward to Nimitz the only way he knew, how amplified and unfiltered, and Nimitz had not been able to get the truth out of it. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz gathered his staff and put the question to them directly. The way he had learned to do the hardest things out loud, in the open, with the people whose judgment he trusted. Should the officer commanding the South Pacific be relieved? One by one, they said yes, it was not a small thing. You do not replace a theater commander in the middle of a battle that is still hanging by a thread. It sends a tremor through every headquarters in the fleet. It ends a career, and in this case, it ended the career of a man Nimitz had known and worked alongside for years. The safe move, the move that protected everyone's reputation, that avoided the tremor and the consequences, was to leave things as they were and hope that the situations stabilized on its own. Nimitz did not make the safe move. He sent the name of the man he wanted to Admiral Ernest King in Washington, William F. Halsey, a carrier admiral, aggressive, combative, already known and already trusted by the sailors and Marines who would be fighting under him. A man who understood that a command was not an administrative function conducted from a desk in a safe harbor. King approved it without hesitation. On the 18th of October, 1942, the change was made. And what happened next, in those first hours after the news reached the men in the field, tells you something about leadership that no manual ever quite captures. One officer who was down in the South Pacific when the news came down the line described what he saw. One minute he said, the men were too sick with malaria to crawl out of their foxholes. The next minute they were up and running around and shouting like boys. Nothing about the enemy had changed. Not one Japanese ship had moved from its anchorage. Not one soldier, not one gun. The men on Guadalcanal were just as hungry as the day before, just as sick, just as exhausted. What had changed was at the top, and the men in the mud felt it before the enemy saw anything at all. Halsey flew to Henderson Field within days of taking command. He did not stay in Noumea. He went to the island. In the weeks that followed, the tide began to move. Not easily, not without cost, not in a single dramatic reversal. The Tokyo Express kept coming. The air battles over the island continued. Men kept dying on both sides of the wire. But in the middle of November, in a series of savage night actions in the water off the northern coast of the island, the same water the men had already named for the ships resting on the bottom of it, the Japanese lost something they could not replace. They lost their ability to feed reinforcements onto Guadalcanal faster than they were losing them. The supply line into the island for the enemy was cut. By December, Vandegrift and the division that had held the island through the shelling and the fever and the long weeks when the country back home was not sure it could be done were finally pulled off and sent to rest. Fresh troops came in, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Guadalcanal held, and the Pacific War, for the first time, began to move in one direction and stayed moving that way. Now, consider the two men at the center of this story. Both spent their lives in the Navy. Both had earned their commands the hard way through decades of service and the accumulation of professional knowledge that comes from a career at sea. Both were given the same information, the same message traffic, the same reports. One of them ran the fight from a ship in a quiet harbor. He read the dispatches that came in. He answered them. He sent his own reports up the chain. He was doing the job precisely as he had been trained to do it. The words on his desk told him a story, and he had no way to know whether the story was true because he had never stood on the ground the stories described. The other one got on a plane, flew into a place where the shells fell most nights, and walked the mud where the line had almost broken. He came back knowing what the first man never learned. The difference between them was not courage in the conventional sense. It was not some quality of character that one man possessed and the other lacked. The difference was simpler than that, and in its own way, harder than that. One of them went to sea for himself, the other stayed with the paper. Chester Nimitz would go on to command the entire Pacific War all the way to the morning of September 2nd, 1945, when he stood on the deck of a battleship anchored in Tokyo Bay and put his name on the document that ended it. He directed fleets across the largest ocean on Earth for 3 more years of fighting. He made decisions that moved hundreds of thousands of men and shaped the fate of nations. And he carried all of that weight quietly in the manner of men who have learned that the noise of command is not the same thing as the work of command. But the habit that separated him from the men who led from a distance and never came to sea was not something learned in a headquarters building. It was not something written in any manual. It was demonstrated and tested and proven on a cratered airstrip in the Solomon Islands, in a few hours in the mud on an island that no one back home was certain could be held, on the morning that the most important American in the Pacific decided that the only way to learn the truth was to go and stand. He knew what it cost to make that trip. He made it anyway. The Marines held the ridge. Vandegrift held the island. And the war turned on the fact that one man at the right moment understood that there are things you cannot learn from paper. If your father or your grandfather served in those waters in 1942 on the island itself, or on the ships in the Sound or in the air above it, whatever piece of that story he carried home with him, whatever he told you at the kitchen table or on the porch or late at night when he finally felt like talking, that story matters. Leave it in the comments. His name, his unit. Whatever piece of it, you still carry. The history books recorded the admirals. They did not record him. But you heard it, and that means it doesn't have to disappear.